Hello, writers. Come write with me. My name is Michaela Greenwood. I create worlds for mind adventures. Welcome to my channel, Write with Michaela. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you can go on this journey with me. Today is Friday, which is story time, or the day of our chapter exchange. If you're writing with me and you wish to exchange chapters, then send your chapter with written permission to writewithmichaela@gmail.com. I will post the email address at the end of the video as well. I'm looking forward to reading your chapters, even if I can't read them all on the channel. All chapters read on Fridays, whether they are mine or another writer's work, are copyright protected material, and no one may use any part in writing their own stories. This story is PG-13. I don't really write children's books. Well, I have a couple children's books here, but they're not going to be read on the channel most likely. So, if you are under 13 years of age, you need parental guidance. This story is in its rough draft stage, just as the last two stories we've heard. And the title of the story is Elloni's Pride, Breaking Point. And today we are reading chapter 1 out of book 1. If you would like to read along, then send to the email I stated earlier and request a PDF of the chapter. Make sure you're specific about either City of the Ancients, Tahia, or Elloni's Pride, Breaking Point, and which chapter. Now, let's start. Elloni's Pride, book 1, Breaking Point. This is chapter 1, Escape. Trenton looked up from setting the table as his father, Hector, came in. Trenton had seen Bradley leave the village and return, but Bradley hadn't gone straight south to the pond, and Trenton wanted to talk to someone about it. But as he looked at his paw, he knew his paw would just grow suspicious. So Trenton decided to try to follow Bradley the next time he left. Trenton continued helping set up for dinner and helping his grandfather to sit to the table without saying anything. Aldemia was also setting the table in her small home. Her mother was extra quiet this evening, but Aldemia knew it was because tomorrow was the full moon. And the full moon always reminded her mother of Shimri. Even though Shimri had died almost 3 years ago, the full moon always brought memories of that dreadful night. That night, there hadn't been enough to eat, and Shimri was crying because she was still hungry. But the soldiers didn't like the crying, so they killed the 2-year-old. Aldemia knew if they had protested and said there hadn't been enough food, the soldiers would have still killed someone, because the soldiers felt truly there were too many people, and if they had fewer people, then no one would be hungry. Kinsesi was 8, and she was trying to help her sister Aldemnia, and even Talta, who was just over 3, was carrying the silverware to the table. None of them spoke. Suddenly, Aldemnia got a pain in her chest, and she thought, why would they come tonight? Try as she might, she could not convince herself that the soldiers weren't coming. So she silently repeated the prayer her grandmother had taught her, and she extended the prayer over her 2 sisters. Her grandmother told her to say the prayer every time the soldiers came, but Aldemnia decided she needed the prayer now, and it wouldn't hurt anything. Besides, the soldiers wouldn't know what she thought in her head. Mesir Salvis Spiritus os infiltide, decido padat silvici ecta dolusolosi, eki arban marshiri, Ethial Doman. Aldemia just repeated the prayer over and over in her mind, and she thought that she wanted the prayer extended to her two sisters. She didn't really think about extending it over her mother because her mother surely knew the prayer and could say it over herself. It was late, and finally things had quieted down in Underwood Village. Everyone had finished supper, washed, put away dishes. The only lights were from candles, oil lamps, and various fires throughout the village. The moon was nearly full as well, and it was almost straight up in the sky. Jarson and Lydia, one of his twins, slipped down to the cellar, and then to the underground chamber with Libya, the other twin. Libya had the symbol of a linker show on her arm at birth, and Jarson briefly saw it before it faded. The symbol wouldn't reappear until her dragon hatched. Since Libya was a twin, she got to come out and visit the village some of the time, and her twin Lydia would stay hidden. One reason the names were so similar was to allow this. Thankfully, Jarson had listened to the prophets and the prophecies, and thankfully, Libya was born first. Jarson had quickly hid his child in the underground chamber and made it back up in time for Lydia's birth. King Damontade had been taking over many things, and his soldiers barged into their small, quaint home to watch Lydia's birth and to look for the mark. If they had seen the mark, they would have killed Lydia on the spot. And that was before things were as bad as they were now. As Jarson traversed the narrow tunnel, all these memories flooded through him. He knew the soldiers would come tomorrow evening when the moon was full, and he knew it was close to time for Libya to leave them and find her dragon. Jarson didn't want to lose his daughter, but she was their hope for freedom once again. Tears threatened to run down his face, but now wasn't the time to cry. Jarson entered the chamber, and the light from his candle spilt into the room. Libya looked up at the light, and she was surprised to see her sister too. She jumped up to embrace each of them. Jarson set the candle down and sat down on a crate. He pulled each girl on a knee. "Libya, my dear sweet child, I'm afraid you will have to leave soon, and I will miss you. You remember everything I've told you?" "Yes, Pa," she replied. "I find a dragon, and then another, and another, until I find 10. And we rebuild the dragons, not under bad potions, and then we rescue you." Jarson squeezed her shoulders tightly. "That's my girl." Then they heard a noise that sounded like barking. Jarson stood quickly as he let the girl slide down to the ground. "The moon's not full tonight. Come, Lydia, we must hurry and exit." They hurried out of the chamber into the tunnel and made their way back to the home. Libya's heart raced hard in her chest as she reached for the candle. She blew out its flame, and then the symbol vibrated within her and on her arm as a light from within her burst forth upon her arm and shone through her long sleeve. She knew her dragon was hatching somewhere, as she knew the light would draw the soldiers to her. So she went to the chamber doorway and looked the way her father and sister ran. Libya then looked down the other way, and everything was dark. Libya didn't want to run down the dark tunnel, but she heard the barking, and it was maddening, and it brought more fear to her tonight than it ever had before. Libya felt deep within her that she had to get away. The light from the symbol dimly lit things through the sleeve, but Libya knew she needed to wrap her arm, and she was already pulling the strip of cloth from her pocket in her dress. She ran towards the hole where she was to climb up, but then she turned back and grabbed the bundle that she was supposed to bring, because wrapping her arm made her think about needing things. Then she ran as fast as she could towards the hole once more. Her hole was far away. So she hoped to get to the end before the dogs entered the house, or worse yet, the tunnel. Jarson and Lydia climbed out of the cellar, closed the cellar door, and threw the rug over it. They replaced the table on the rug seconds before the soldiers barged in, and the soldiers could see their fear. Jarson knew it, so he tried to cover and said, "Tonight is not the full moon." The lead soldier took his club and hit Jarson hard, knocking Jarson over. He smiled and laughed because he knew there was always more fear in the people in the homes farther south when the soldiers visited them first and ended with the homes in the north before they left, instead of the other way around. And he always reported that extra fear to the king. Sylvie, the mother, covered her scream, and the children all crouched down, with the oldest two pulling the youngest two behind them. "Line up, the children. We must count them," said the lead soldier. Sylvie motioned to her oldest son, and then the oldest daughter, and then the next son. Then she motioned to Lydia, then her youngest son, and finally her youngest daughter. The soldier glared at the children as he counted the 6 children. "Show me their forearms." As calmly as possible, Sylvie said, "Boys and girls, raise your sleeves." The boys undid their buttons and pushed up their sleeves, but the youngest boy needed help. So Sylvie nervously helped him. She briefly glanced to her husband, who hadn't really moved off the floor, and who was holding his face in pain. As she pushed up the youngest son's sleeve, she thought, somehow the soldiers knew the symbol would show tonight. Her heart tightened in her chest, and she hoped beyond hope that they wouldn't look for the cellar. Then she untied the lace ribbon at the end of the youngest girl's sleeve. Sylvie moved behind the children as the older children held out their arms. The younger two didn't know what to do. The soldier roughly grabbed a child's hand and examined the arm. He did each in turn. As the soldier finished examining arms, the soldier with the dogs came in, and the dogs sniffed around. Jarson eased up to a sitting position, and as he did, he noticed the rug's edge flipped up on one side, and he could see the entrance to the cellar. He calmed himself with the knowledge that the cellar door was hard to see if the brackets remained hidden. He looked at his children and his wife, and he saw them gently rubbing on the younger ones' backs to keep them calm. After several uncomfortable minutes, the soldiers with the dogs moved on, and then the other soldiers went to the next house. But Jarson and Sylvie dared not speak yet. Jarson did casually flip the rug down. In many ways, it was important not to speak. Not just because the soldiers might overhear, but also to teach the young ones not to make a sound when the soldiers were around. Jarson and Sylvie both tried to think of the little prophecy they remembered, to see if they could discern why this visit was before the full moon. But the prophecy was so old in their minds, and the few remnants left didn't provide any answers. In a dungeon cell, King Damontate had a single prisoner, and he had this prisoner chained up. The prisoner could hardly move his hands to his mouth when they brought him food, and there were many days between when King Damontate's soldiers would bring this prisoner down to the mines. But they never kept the man in the mines very long. The man's name was Browser, and many suspected and accused him of doing more magic than Browser felt he knew. Browser was the last linker of the last group, and King Damontate knew that the symbol on Browser's arm would light up with the birth of a dragon. So he had soldiers watching the cell day and night. King Damontate thought it was foolish to keep the linker, and he wanted to kill him and his dragon that he also had in a cell chained up. But for now, he listened to his prophet, Kishon. Suddenly, a light burst forth on Browser's arm, and Browser jerked awake. Then Browser heard a soldier outside his cell. He looked up and saw the soldier for a brief moment, and then the soldier took off. Browser sighed to himself. He hoped the new dragons weren't related to his dragon, but now with the birth, King Damantade wouldn't need him, and he would execute him. He wished he had been more studious when he was learning magic. Then maybe he could sneak out. But as he wished that and sighed, because he felt that was impossible. That sentence isn't smooth. I will edit that. Half a day's walk west of the village lay a ring of mountains. The mountains were more rectangular than circular, and in the center lay a long pond. Mostly no one went into these mountains, but on the far southwestern edge of the ridge of mountains, in a cave, sat a large egg. The cave was barren except for a copper orb and the egg, and the cave had a magical protection and an illusion charm, which slowed down time so the egg wouldn't hatch in the normal 99 days. The caster cast the charm multiple times. The time charm multiple times. So many times, in fact, that the caster lost count of the number of times she cast the charm. No one knew when to expect the baby dragons. But now was the time for the first dragon. The egg rocked a little and then started cracking. And as it cracked, the magical protection and illusion began resolving. The egg cracked some more and some more until a beautiful green dragon emerged. The dragon was slim and long. The dragon looked around as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. Then she spotted the copper orb. She bent her neck down and sniffed it, and as she did, her nose touched a button. The orb emitted some light, and then a holographic message projected onto and above the cavern floor. A voice came from the image. Elloni, we're deeply sorry that you cannot be born among us. We were in dark times and had to hide you. By the time you hatch, many of us may be dead, or our brains manipulated with poison. You are one of 10. So you must find your linker, and you must find the rest of your smaller pride. All of you must develop your skills before you fight. Then the light blinked away and faded. The cave was once again dark, except for a small stream of gray light, which left the orb and went to Elloni. The stream of light was the immediate knowledge an adult dragon would pass a baby dragon at birth. The adult dragons hiding the eggs didn't know if the knowledge would stay in the orb or not, and they didn't know if it would release and find the baby dragon, but it was their best hope. Baby dragons needed a lot of knowledge at birth, and these babies wouldn't be born in a pride, so they needed even more. Thankfully, the knowledge had stayed in the orb, and thankfully, it went into Elloni. Although, the knowledge wouldn't open to her all at once. Once the gray light vanished, Elloni pushed the button again and listened to the message again. Then she listened to it a third time before she started to exit her cave. Elloni walked to the edge of the cave and saw darkness, so she just lay down to sleep. She would explore in the morning and the light, which she somehow knew would come. When Libya reached the hole, she was shaking like she never had before in her life. She hadn't run the whole way. She would walk to catch her breath and then run again, because even at her young age, she knew what death was, and she knew King Damantade would have her killed. so she forced herself to run, and now to climb. Libya reached the top of the hole, and she listened. She could still hear the dogs, and their barks echoed all around her. Although none of the dogs were in close proximity, long arms of the bush covered the hole, so she eased out and gazed around. From what her father told her, she needed to head the same direction as the tunnel. But Libya was too scared to move out from the bush. Her heart beat hard in her chest as she went through all her father told her. Libya knew the dogs would smell her, because her father told her that the dogs could smell the ground hours later and know which way she walked. These thoughts entered her mind. You cannot stay there. You must move on. Libya didn't know how the thoughts came into her mind, but she knew she agreed with them. She thought of climbing a tree, but she knew the dogs would smell her at the bottom of the tree. What she needed was water, like a river. Her father told her if she didn't go straight across the river, the dogs wouldn't find her as easily. Libya carefully exited the bush without getting too many thorns stuck in her clothes. She wanted to make sure the bush didn't have any of her hair or clothes, but she couldn't see that well in the moonlight. So she hurried on until she heard the howl of a dog, and she froze stiff. Her chest was in pain, and her neck was stiff. Keep going. The dogs are still in the village, thoughts. I will erase your tracks and scent that you leave. Once again, Libya didn't know how the thoughts came into her mind, and the thoughts were rather strange. But her father told her that she would know the thoughts of her dragon once her dragon hatched. So she forced herself to hurry on. She hoped the thoughts meant her dragon was close. But then she thought she didn't know how to hide a dragon, and it might be better if the dragon was farther away. Hector was very angry with the soldiers for the unexpected visit, and he wanted to know why they came before the full moon. But he didn't say anything. Trenton knew his father was angry, and he was scared his father might say something. But Trenton turned to helping two of his younger brothers and his younger sister with their sleeves because his mother was rubbing his father's arm to calm him down. When the soldiers came in Hoshman's home, Bradley knew he shouldn't have waited to get the Linkers out, but there was nothing he could do now. He watched his mother and father to see how they tried to remain calm, and he tried to imitate them. He knew they were extra scared because this visit wasn't normal. The soldiers always came the night of the full moon, not the night before. Bradley just prayed that he would get the chance to help the Linkers escape. He prayed and prayed that the soldiers didn't find the Linkers this night. Aldemnia helped her sisters with their sleeves as calmly as she could. And now she knew why she had the feelings to pray the prayer. She didn't know what the words meant. She just knew her grandmother told her that she must pray it when the soldiers came. And her grandmother made her promise to say the prayer. Aldemnia thought, well, Grandma, I said the prayer even when I didn't know the soldiers were coming. Then a random thought went through her mind. But you did know they were coming. You felt it deep within you. Aldemnia glanced at her mother. She never told her mother everything her grandmother taught her, but she felt her mother somehow knew. She wished right now she could send thoughts to her mother and tell her mother that somehow things would get better. Aldemnia didn't know how things would get better, but she wanted to think that to her mother. Jarson's chest was still tight as he sat in a chair, but he was finally able to take a breath as his wife finished cleaning his face where the soldiers had hit him. He wanted to go back in the tunnel and tell Libya to leave, to run for her life. But he couldn't. He just had to wait on the soldiers to pull out. Sylvie got some thread because Jarson needed a stitch or two, and Kala, her oldest daughter, was helping her. Then they heard a shrill cry. No! Everyone froze, and their hearts gripped them tightly in their chests. They rubbed the backs of the little ones who didn't understand the tension. The rest of them knew that these heart-wrenching moments, when they heard these shrill cries, was a moment of death. It was the scream of a mother who had just seen her child die. A soldier had taken a life. Sylvie slightly jumped, as they all had. Then she covered her mouth with her hand and closed her eyes. Tears ran out from under her lids and down her face. She dropped to her knees and hugged all the children she could. The stitches would have to wait a few minutes, because right now her hands were shaking with the rest of her body. She didn't know how much longer they could live like this. Jarson dropped down beside them and wrapped his arms around them all as well. He knew if they didn't get the Linkers out to their dragons soon, there might not be any of them left to rescue. Already the soldiers had taken several men to the mines. Their youngest child was almost 3, and his wife had not conceived yet. Again, that meant the soldiers might soon take him too. Also, their oldest daughter was 12, so she would need to marry and conceive once she started her menstruation. Jarson felt blessed to have so many children, but at the same time he didn't want the soldiers to take him and leave his wife with so many responsibilities. Then came another scream of anguish. At these times they knew a child died, but they didn't know if the child had a symbol or not, because they never discussed that in the village. No one knew who the parents of the Linkers were. They didn't know how many there were. They knew there were supposed to be 10. But the soldiers had killed more than 10 children. In fact, Jarson felt that the last scream they heard was the 18th one killed in the past 3 or 4 years. Jarson lost count of the years before that, mostly because it was too heartbreaking to keep count. Of course, if he really wanted to know, he could ask Hector. Hector kept track of all the births and deaths, at least of those he knew. Fortunately, the soldiers didn't know he knew, and even more fortunately, Hector didn't know about Libya. Finally, they heard the barks of the dogs grow dimmer, and the night grow silent. All Jarson's family were tired, so Sylvie quickly put in 3 stitches, and then they turned down the oil lamps and blew out the candles and went to bed without talking. They did rub each other's arms or back, and they hugged the little ones before they turned in to give each one the support they also needed in such a desperate situation. The stress of the living conditions was too much to bear, so soon everyone but Lydia was fast asleep. Lydia lay awake a long time. Deep in her heart, she felt she would never see her sister again. She wanted to go down to the cellar to see her sister and hug her sister one last time, but she felt that Libya was no longer there. So her heart ached as she missed her sister. She wished that her father had left her in the cellar with Libya, and they could be together. But as she wished that, she heard in her mind the screams of the night all over again. And she didn't want the soldiers to kill anyone in her family because they didn't count her. The sadness was overwhelming. So she cried silent tears until her tears soaked her pillow, and she felt her body could take no more shaking. Soflin, the witch, had managed to live outside of the village for several decades now, and she was successful at sending Libya thoughts to move her along. After Libya left, Soflin used her magic to cover Libya's immediate trail, and she cast a couple of charms on the girl so she could keep track of her now that she wasn't in the village. Basically, Soflin worked without the villagers knowing. She had cast and recast charms on the 3 linkers they had in the village, and so far the soldiers had not found or killed the 3 here. She knew there were 10 dragons, but there might only be 5 linkers. She hoped the other 2 linkers were in the kingdom northeast of King Damontade's kingdom, or in the other village. With 3 linkers here in Underwood Village, she didn't chance traveling to the other kingdom or village to find the other 2 linkers. If there were 7 more linkers, then who knew how safe they were or weren't. Even though she didn't live in the village, tonight's escapade had her rattled. In her meditation this morning, she felt like she needed to be on the western edge of the village. But she almost dismissed it, because the moon wasn't full tonight. Thankfully, she went, and was able to cast the charms to erase Libya's tracks and scent. But the question lingered with her of why? Why did King Damontade suddenly change when he sent the soldiers? Was it because they hadn't found anything? Was it because they found and read more prophecies? Soflin didn't know. But she reminded herself to not doubt the universe when it spoke to her. Underwood Village needed to send Broman out next. Soflin worried that Broman wouldn't heed all the warnings his father had given him. But at the moment, she couldn't let herself think on that. She just had to hope that Libya found her dragon, and the dragon hatched just fine. Soflin knew that Libya's symbol shone with light because she caught glimpses of it. So she knew Libya's dragon, Elloni, was hatching. She also knew all the eggs were close in age, and all should hatch close in time together. Broman's dragon, Hagar, would hatch soon too, if he hadn't already. But with seeing the dim light on Libya, it reminded her of the prophecy. So she wanted to reread things when she got back home. Finally, she heard the dogs heading back north. They did not head west, so whatever trail she didn't cover had time to fade. Next, she needed to get to the east side of the village without the soldiers or dogs discovering her. She didn't know if Broman's father had a plan to send Broman out or not, and they certainly didn't have as long of a tunnel as Libya's family had. But she knew it needed to be soon, and she hoped her morning meditation tomorrow would give her the knowledge she would need to be in close proximity to also cast charms to remove Broman's tracks and scent. Soflin reminded herself not to worry. She did her part and felt the universe would do its part and provide the necessary help to the other linkers that she didn't know. Trenton lay awake, but he pretended to sleep. He didn't know how anyone in his home could sleep with his father's pacing. His father would say things under his breath, and sometimes he would shake his fist. Trenton didn't see his father, but he knew his father's habits. Sometimes he could make out a few of his father's words, but not this night. Trenton's mother and grandfather had tried more than a few times to get Hector to go to bed, but to no avail. It would be very late before Hector could calm enough to go to bed. Aldemnia lay awake in bed most nights, and tonight was no different. She prayed to her grandmother and told her she left them too soon. She wanted her grandmother to tell her to leave the village. Aldemnia thought they had no reason to stay, save for the graves of her grandmother and her sister. Maybe her mother hoped the soldiers would return her father. but Aldimnia didn't believe they would. Aldimnia felt that staying in Underwood Village was just waiting for death. Finally, late in the night, Aldimnia thought that she needed a way to convince her mother to leave. If they left after the night of the full moon, if they left, someone else would die because they were gone. Aldimnia sighed. That would be her mother's argument. How could she argue with that? She didn't know. But if ever an opportunity presented itself to her to leave with her two sisters, she would take it and never look back. Libya had walked a long time. She was very tired and wanted to stop, but she kept going. Every time she thought about stopping to rest, she would hear the dogs bark echoing. She didn't know if the barks were just in her mind or if they were real, but they spurred her on. Suddenly she heard a small splash and looked down. Her foot had hit the edge of some water. Libya looked up, and the sky was getting lighter, although she could not yet see the sun. Libya looked back at the water, and it was moving, so she thought it must be the river her father told her about. She saw a rock poking its head up through the water, so she hopped over to it, and then hopped to several more rocks, until she was near the center of the river. There were more rocks in the middle of the river, so she walked north along the rocks, but she didn't know her direction was north. That would have scared her, because her father always talked about King Damantide being in the north. After a little while, she ran out of rocks, so she eased her foot down in the river. She didn't know how long she should walk in the water for the dogs to lose her scent, but she thought when she saw the sun, she would exit the river on the other side. She feared sleeping on the ground, so she would find a tree to climb, and she would try to sleep in a tree. Okay, writers, that is the end of chapter 1. As I read, I noticed that I didn't describe the characters as I introduced them. I don't think I did that in Tahia either. I think I described a couple, like Wagler and Cessny. I think I described them in Tahia, but the rest of the characters I didn't really describe. So, that will be some of the edits I add later on to both of these stories. Now, we know that Libya is a linker, and her dragon Elloni has hatched. We know the dragons laid the eggs a long time ago, but someone said spells over the eggs and over the caves where the dragons hid them. So, leave a comment below on how you would feel if you were Libya when she heard the dogs barking and suddenly the light burst forth on her arm. Would you have been too scared to leave the bush? Would you have listened to the thoughts in your head? Or leave a comment on if you were Hector. Would you have said something to the soldiers for coming the night before the full moon? Or would you have kept your mouth shut as well? Would you be angry with the soldiers? Or angry with yourself for not saying anything? Leave those comments. Join me Tuesday for a writing prompt or some jargon or vocabulary. Join me Friday for Elloni's Pride, Breaking Point, Chapter 2, the next 2 linkers. Visit my website, bymckella.com, and read some character bios. Leave a comment on which characters on the website are your favorites so far. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and the bell so we can continue to write together. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your participation. If you know someone who would like this video, then please share it with them. This is Michaela with Write with Michaela. Bye for now.